All right, and now I would like to invite Franziska Zimmermann, Director, Sustainability and Climate Change Strategy, Temasek, up on stage to join Vinamra for a fireside chat on navigating sustainability in an uncertain environment. Let's give them a round of applause, shall we?
Thank you, Franziska, for taking out the time to be with us today. For those of us who are very plugged into the Singapore sustainability ecosystem, Franziska is no stranger to us. She's been championing sustainability, not only, I must say, for the Temasek portfolio of companies, but for the industry in general. So now is the time for me to speak the least and hand this over to Franziska. Franziska, we wanted to start first with what is Temasek's sustainability strategy? Could you help many of us who are not so familiar with it, rationalize it from the point of view, what's important to you and where you're focusing on it here?
Sure, happy to, and thank you for having me here. Obviously, it's like coming home to family. So thank you very much for that, and I heard you had a great morning session already. Maybe for those who are a bit less familiar with Temasek, and I think this is probably where the starting point of why we even care about sustainability is, right? We are a long-term investor. We're part of the Singapore reserve system, and we are supposed to be here for future generations. And so I think naturally it comes with our mandate that we cannot just think about our returns in a short term, but also we want to be here longer term for future generations. And there's no point in us having, very high returns today, but sort of erode and undermine, the substance of the economy and of the society in which, an economy thrives in. So for us, this is really, in a way, also the setting on, it's quite clear when we think about what are some of the future scenarios on climate, what are some of the future scenarios on water, on resource scarcity, that we need to care about these things. We need to make sure that we can be successful in the long term as Temasek, as Singapore, as broader society, globally as well. We have taken that step and actually baked sustainability into our long-term firm-wide strategy. We have our Temasek Strategy 2030, where sustainability at the core is one of the central pillars of the overall strategy. And we've been diving a little bit deeper to articulate what that actually means. And I think, for those of you who are a bit more familiar with us as well, obviously the real estate sector is one of the sectors that we're invested in, but we're invested across multiple sectors. We have portfolio companies in tech, in consumer, in healthcare, in agri, in transport and logistics, and financial services, and so forth. So naturally, our sustainability strategy, in a way, is fairly broad and reflects also perhaps what we need to achieve as a society at large. And so for us, the outcomes that we strive to contribute towards is obviously net zero, nature positive, and inclusive growth. These are, I would say, from a topical perspective, what we care about. How do we go about it? I think, one of the things that is not very surprising is, as an asset owner, our capital is our biggest muscle. So investing with sustainability in mind is one of the key levers that we want to pursue. And there it's really about two dimensions, is what we invest in, and the second one is how we invest. The first one around what we invest in is really how do we deploy capital in a way that we can also catalyze some of the solutions that are necessary to address some of the future problems. We have tried to create, on the basis of the various taxonomies out there, our own in-house sustainable living trends investment framework. We have quantified that at this point in time, 44 billion of our capital or of our portfolio value is in those sustainable living trend-aligned investments, whereof 5 of them are in what we call climate transition investments. So this is something that we're very tracking very closely, and we hope that we can grow the share and the amount of those assets moving forward. The second point about how we invest is we have an ESG framework, I think similar to you as well, right, where we think about at the point of our investment decision, making sure that we do not invest in assets that are, intrinsically problematic or creating damage to either the environment or have societal impacts that we cannot stand behind. So we have that ESG framework, which actually spans across the life cycle of our investments, both from pre-investment all the way to post-investment engagement as well. A few other levers that we activate is, the third one is around engaging our portfolio companies. And I think, many of you at CapitaLand have been also invited to some of our workshops, some of our gatherings as well. But we also hold one-on-one dialogues with some of our key companies as well to think about how are they tracking on climate transition, for example. We've created a climate transition readiness framework that we use to really create a portfolio level view on where our companies are. We also have a portfolio value creation playbook where we engage some of those companies.
I'm always scared going into those sessions, like going to an exam hall and trying to see where do we stand. So she's been kind.
Well, I think I wouldn't be here if I wasn't pleased with your own strategy as well. So it's always good to have that dialogue. Actually, we learn as much from our companies as I guess anybody could learn from us on what we bring to those conversations on the basis of example of others. So.
Yeah. Is a lot of this strategy, Franziska, driven by the global ESG themes? I mean, what are the things globally that you're seeing that you think are going to come into play strongly in the Singapore ecosystem and thereby impacting all of us now?
Yeah, I mean, look, we are in that week. We're in Cali in Colombia. We have a big gathering on nature. And I think that's one of the things that we see, right? While the conversation on climate is still super important and continues to be important, so don't get me wrong on this, we see that it is expanding into nature. I think we're all clear we cannot solve the climate challenge without decarbonization on one hand, but also a focus on, the carbon sinks and what do we need to do to keep those carbon sinks intact. So nature is definitely one of the topics that I can see is coming into the conversation quite strongly. But also decarbonization, the conversation is becoming more real. I feel it's moving away from just commitment and targets to what are we actually doing. And so our investor lens is also shifting from asking for just, what are your emissions to what are you actually going to do about it. So to your earlier point on transition plans, being clear about also CapEx and OpEx that you require to put those transition plans into practice and how do you go about it is something that we increasingly care about. And I think the third observation, and that also is a point where we care about in our own strategy, is new forms of collaboration. I think there's an increasing awareness that no single entity can really make an impact and solve something on their own. It's really about sector collaboration and even across the different sectors. What are some of the new models that we need to figure out to really advance the game, right? You mentioned also sustainability-linked loans. So how does finance come in, for example? But also within your value chain, the building materials sector, all of these things. How can we collaborate more intensely and in an accelerated way to solve some of the challenges?
Are there any examples of regions or companies or public sector where you're seeing some of this collaboration play out well?
Well, if for example, in a sector, right, if you think about what has happened here in Singapore with the aviation sector, where you had the regulators come together with, developers and producers of sustainable aviation fuels, with the airport authority, with the airlines, and figure out what does it take to make sustainable aviation fuel a reality, I think that is one of those examples of how a new industry collaboration, or actually beyond the industry, has started to galvanize result, right? So this is one of those perhaps examples I could bring in.
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant point. Just as a reminder to the audience, please feel free to put in your questions. I think there'll be a QR code up there or behind your badges, and we'll be very happy to take them after around 10 minutes or so. So in this context, Franziska, how should Singapore companies approach the sort of uncertain ESG environment, right? There's a whole geopolitical sort of divide. We don't know what's going to happen with the elections. Every region is sort of pushing through in a different way, and they got different challenges, right? Some more regulatory, some more operational. And then you have these Singaporean companies, a lot of them which are multinationals, which have footprints everywhere. So any advice from you on how we should be looking at such diversity and uncertainty today?
It's a very relevant question, and I'm not sure I have a very good answer to it, but I think we all need to keep the eyes on the future, and I think we need to acknowledge that we are living in this world full of uncertainty. So what do we do if we live in a world of uncertainty? Is maybe we don't think about one single future, but about, let's say, 5 or 6 different possible futures, and then step back and think about how is my business positioned if any of those futures is going to play out. And this is, in essence, scenario planning, right? So how do I need to position my business in a way that I can be agile enough to adapt to whatever of those scenarios is going to play out, to make sure that I can still be successful and not just put my chips on one single scenario that may or may not happen. So I think, being forward, being agile, being also able to live with some of the uncertainties and say, I actually know where I want to go, but I know that I may need to pivot along the way. I think that's probably one of those core skills.
And you feel stakeholders, whether it's investors, customers, partners, will sort of appreciate that, the fact that I may not have an immediate answer for the next 3 to 4 years, but I broadly know the direction I want to take.
I believe so. I mean, at least in my view, right, being humble, being honest about the different uncertainties and being frank about those, meaning disclosing that maybe there's certain factors that you don't know how it's going to be, but also communicate what are some of the assumptions on the basis of which you plan on. I think that's always the best strategy, and then you can leave it to all the other stakeholders to make their judgment on whether they feel you're making the right call or not.
Yeah, I like the honesty and the humility bit. And from some of our investor conversations, that's what we've been seeing as well. I do see empathy and understanding of the challenges on the ground, but at the same time push on, okay, despite those challenges, what are you doing to get around those challenges? And there, then if you make a couple of mistakes, it's understandable because those mistakes are made by trying. So they would rather try and maybe sometimes trip yourself, but maybe not too frequently, and then keep moving rather than be inactive in the face of that uncertainty, right? This was about companies, right? I just want to elevate it to boards. Increasingly, we are seeing, because of the disclosures pressures and expectations on boards as well, right? You manage so many companies as a portfolio, so many boards. Sort of what are you seeing on the governance rigors coming on boards, and how should really boards be responding to that?
I think we've seen a rapid acceleration as well of board awareness that sustainability is actually under their purview, right? I would say in 2015, when I joined Temasek, I think very few of the boards were thinking about sustainability very actively. Some of them, they were updated by the teams on some of the CSR programs or some of the achievements, some of the early companies, and I think yourselves included, had already sustainability reports at that point, which were obviously signed off by the board. But I think nowadays, the board members have become more aware, and this is driven by a couple of things. I think, first of all, investors in shareholder meetings would ask some of those questions. So these are questions that, board members may not have heard, 10 years or even 5 years back. And there's even in certain regions, not in Singapore to my knowledge, but in certain regions, you can see actually shareholders are voting against board members if, no credible transition plans are in place or not sufficient disclosures are being made. So you can see there's sort of the shareholder voice that becomes a little bit more demanding, even in the formal settings. And of course, that's matters to the board. You can also in certain regions start to see lawsuits against independent board directors, and some of these trends just show that various stakeholder groups are holding the boards accountable, not just the companies themselves.
You think that will come to Asia as well, because we see that more in the West right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. If I had a crystal ball, perhaps not as quickly, because one of the observations I have, obviously making that personal journey coming from the West to Asia, here a few of those issues are being resolved behind closed doors first, right? So it's a bit less litigious as a society and a bit less public, I think, in the conversation, but definitely I think some of those conversations will be held as well.
Interesting. And just switching gears on the social side, right? A lot of times we see that most of the discussion ends up happening on climate change, and for the right reasons. And now you talked about nature earlier. How do you see the emphasis on social integration into business growth strategies? Are there regions where you're seeing more of that is happening? Are there any good examples you can think of? Yeah.
So the social side is something where I would say is the starting point for many companies, and it's natural for many companies because it's your own workforce in many ways, right? It's your customers, it's your suppliers. There's a lot of this value chain dimension, which makes also your business successful. So I think many companies have had a certain focus on that already, maybe have not been talking about it as a very explicit focus. It does come to the fore and more prominent now, and some of this is driven by new regulations. I don't know whether you've been talking this morning also about what's going on in the EU with the EU supply chain, CS-triple-D, all the acronyms, I'm getting caught up in it, the Supply Chain Due Diligence Directive, right? Where not just companies in Europe, but actually companies anywhere in the world who have certain exposure to the Europe market suddenly are required to disclose what they do on supply chains and how they engage their vendors on labor rights, human rights in their supply chains, and make sure that they can mitigate any of the negative social impacts. So you will see that this topic will probably elevate further over the next years. And there's also a similar framework that's being created, the Task Force on Inequality and Social Financial Disclosures, I believe, TISFD. So after TCFD, TNFD, we now have TISFD. So you will see that whole framework will be coming together and eventually be integrated into ISSB. So there is you can see the markings and the writings on the wall that this
I guess as long as it's all bundled up under ISSB, then that works, because the last thing you want is more disclosures through more reports.
Exactly. And I think Sue Lloyd has a nice way of saying it, is like we're moving from ABC alphabet soup of voluntary standards to regulatory fragmentation. And we all hope that's not going to happen. Actually, the vision for ISSB is to be a unifying framework that's hopefully globally acceptable. And
absolutely. And I think for many companies like ourselves, it's really not the question of transparent reporting. We've been doing that. It's just to do it in the most efficient manner.
Exactly.
So that it's focused and impactful.
Exactly.
Right? Okay, I had promised Franziska we'll have a good Q&A round, and I'm glad to see a lot of questions coming in. So I'm going to deep dive straight on it if I can get past this leaf that's blocking my view. Okay. You want to take the internal carbon pricing?
Sure.
How does Temasek use ICP in decarbonizing your portfolio? Or any thoughts around the concept overall, if not just Temasek as well?
Yeah, so we've been introducing our internal carbon price. Oh, now you catch me off guard, in 2020, I believe. And we started off with $35, $40, and we're now at $65 per ton of CO2 equivalent. We use it as a tool for our pre-investment analysis, and every deal that goes to our investment committee factors in the carbon price as one way of thinking about whether that investment actually makes sense or not. So in a way, you increase the hurdle for high-emitting businesses. And what it also means is then the investment teams need to argue why this investment still makes sense. What is the credible transition plan that will actually make sure that we do decarbonize that business fast enough for that cost not to sort of impact our returns. So this is how we use it at Temasek. And I think for many companies, well, first of all, a realistic view on carbon pricing as a risk management tool is just sound practice. But actually for us, it's not just about risk management. It's about helping us to get our portfolio into a space where we are confident that we're not going to have, significant negative exposures and impacts.
And you're getting
more
ready
broadly.
for it. Right? It's
Exactly.
a similar way where we use the shadow internal carbon price to put a price on the carbon upfront at the investment stage, right?
Yeah.
Okay, there's not Temasek specific, but focus on divestment from companies or portfolios. I'll just expand the mandate if they are carbon intensive. Sort of any view on that as a portfolio manager?
Yeah, so I think this is where the conversation has matured, right? I think for a long time for investors, the term was, portfolio decarbonization. And portfolio decarbonization, when you take it to the extreme, you can say it's quite easy. You just divest out of any high-emitting businesses, and this is how you decarbonize your portfolio. But I think there is the recognition that this may not be equal to the real-world impacts that we want to generate. So I think this is where investors have more and more gotten to understand that actually, if you are very intentional with how you deploy your capital, and you say, I'm still ready to invest in high-emitting businesses, but if we put our capital in, it comes with strings attached, that this may be the more powerful lever for decarbonization, right? If you have the means to influence where the company is going, then putting in the dollars to achieve that is actually quite a sound strategy, and that's how we think about it at Temasek as well.
Constructive dialogues on the pathways, right?
If there is willingness and ability to, be a partner in that pathway. Yeah.
Got it. Temasek seemed to have signaled that it'll be making more direct impact investments. Will you be seeing sort of some of that in climate and nature as well? Which I think you already do quite a bit.
In climate for sure, we've been quite well on track. Also with our, and some of you may be familiar with our wholly owned investment platform, Gen Zero. So they have both a tech solution angle, but also a nature-based solution angle. So as of now, our nature-focused investments are mostly spearheaded by our Gen Zero team. But I think when we think about nature-focused investments, and you think about the nature targets are to halt and reverse nature loss. Now, halting nature loss already implies that you would also think about alternative business models to some of the businesses that actually have negative impacts on nature. So this is where I think we at Temasek as the main entity might also come into play if there are, technologies that are having, in that sense, a nature positive impact, or companies with new business models to alternatives that have big nature impacts, this is the kind of thing that we would be interested in for sure.
And while being on nature, there's another question on carbon markets, voluntary ones. Given the upheaval they've been going through over the last year, what is Temasek's view on that?
Well, we're still very committed to the carbon markets, and we still see it as a effective and necessary tool, and especially, I think you said, linked to the nature conversation as well, right? If we are serious about wanting to conserve nature, somehow we need to be able to finance that. And carbon markets is one of the tools in the finance toolbox. If you destroy that tool, what else do you have? Who is going to finance, and how are we going to finance nature conservation? So I fully appreciate there has been a lot of controversy, and there's definitely things that need to be sorted out on carbon markets, and efforts are on the way on the integrity side, on the quality side. So we're quite optimistic that we can actually get to a quality standard that makes those markets operate with, sufficient levels of integrity for that capital to flow also into the nature-based solutions.
Got it. Thanks. I think the other questions we have covered, backsliding on commitments, you can give as good an answer as we can. I don't think we are experts on that. We focus on what we can control. And I think we have addressed the financial angles as well. So, Franziska, last question before we end this engagement. We have a lot of investors and asset managers in the room. Temasek and your team have been, for so many years, leading conversations on ESG with this group. What would be your one key learning takeaway from all those past conversations that you could advise many of us in the room to focus on as we go forward?
Well, maybe one key thing is stay course, right? One of the things that worries me is that also in senior managements and boardrooms, everybody's saying, oh yeah, in the US there's so much backlash against ESG, so much backlash against climate. I'm worried that the senior leadership support moves away. So I think we just need to stay course. We need to keep, understand that this is a critical mission, that it's actually very existential for many of us. And I think just making sure that as a corporate strategy, we can acknowledge that maybe we need to reframe certain of the issues, tune down a bit of the rhetoric, get very real, but stay course because it matters. That's probably one takeaway that I would like to see.
Oh, that's fantastic, extremely relevant, because we often see that it's often the more boring, mundane, day-to-day stuff that continues to move the needle on staying course rather than the exciting headline-making stuff. So very relevant advice. Franziska, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to engage with you. Can you have a round of applause for Franziska, please?
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vinamra and Franziska.